What's up, YouTube? We're back with another episode of Old School Bike Reviews. It's a special one today. I don't even know what you would call it. It ain't a downhill bike. It's not an enduro bike. It's no dirt jumper. You might call it a Franken bike, but its name is Little Bighorn. And this thing is a 20-inch kids bike that has a 26-inch mountain bike fork on it with carbon drop bars. It's single speed and it's an absolute weapon. So this is a fun one. I had this bike for years. I pushed this thing to the limit. I did things that probably should have never been done on it. It nearly took my life a few times. And yeah, this is the story of Little Bighorn. So I've got probably too many stories and ride experiences with this bike. I actually rode it quite a bit for how ridiculous this thing was. On some real mountain bike trails. But before we get into the stories and its performance, because damn did this thing perform, but before we get into all that, we got to tell the origin story of this bike because it's a good one. This was actually my friend's childhood bike when he was 8 or 9. We all went to this local shop, Devil Mountain Cyclery in Walnut Creek at the time, and Arvon donated it, wasn't going to use it anymore, thinking it would go to maybe a kid in need, but instead the staff there, who we were all good friends with at the time, decided to put a 24 or 26-inch Marzocchi fork on it with a massively long steerer, and then put drop bars with a super long stem on it. And Little Bighorn was born. The namesake, I mean, it's pretty obvious. You just got to grab this thing by the drop bars, get in the horns, and just take this thing for a rip. This shop was hilarious. Like, I forget all the details, but I think it was essentially like a somewhat of a money laundering scheme. The whole shop existed, I'm pretty sure, because it was some rich guy in a divorce. He liked bikes, but he was just trying to hide money from his wife, essentially. So he just opened a bike shop to get deals on bikes and essentially hide money. So at least that's how I remember. I could be completely wrong, but what I do remember is that the shop wasn't that worried about making money. So the crew there was just, doing a good job, but it was a pretty low stress environment. And out front of this bike shop is something that was called the Hot Lap. And it was maybe in the shape of a pump track. It had berms, but no rollers. So you couldn't pump. So to put a fast time on the Hot Lap, it was a combination of flat corners, berms, and pedaling. So in the spare time of everyone at the shop, which there seemed to be a lot of, they would whip together these Franken bikes with old and discarded parts and build the most ridiculous stuff for the Hot Lap. And you actually needed a pretty specific bike for the Hot Lap. The berms were really tight, and there were a lot of flat corners that were also really tight. So you wanted a bike that was really short with a short wheelbase, but that you could also pedal. So they were always like going back and forth for the hot time on the Hot Lap. And a lot of ridiculous bikes got born for the Hot Lap, and Little Bighorn was one of them. That's more or less how the bike came to be. Yeah, I ended up taking this bike. I pretty much stole this bike, essentially. The shop ended up closing, because I don't think it was making much money. And I was left with Little Bighorn. But then there were a few times where I didn't really have a mountain bike. I was in between buying and selling, or stuff broke. So I actually rode this as my mountain bike for a short period of time. It actually worked way better than you would think. Like, if this bike had a normal fork and a normal set of handlebars, it would have handled way worse than what this ended up being. It just worked out by complete chance. I don't know, maybe Pat and Justin had a master plan with this thing, but it actually ended up working really well because the fork slackened the bike way out, put the wheel a little bit further out in front of you, and then the long stem and the drop bars actually allowed you to like fit in the bike. Your hand position was like far forward enough where, you could actually like exist in the bike. With a normal cockpit, like, it would have been so cramped that, I don't know, it just would have been like almost impossible to ride. And then the seat was like in the perfect spot, and like the more I rode it, the more I was like, oh my gosh, I can actually rip on this thing. And like I said, I was in between bikes for a little bit. So I took this thing down to Santa Cruz as my only bike and went mountain biking for a day on Little Bighorn. And I ended up shooting like a full edit for this bike, and a lot of the clips in Santa Cruz, I'm riding some like legitimately steep trails and like hitting gap jumps on it with one V brake, just holding on for dear life. And I was able to ride a ridiculous amount of stuff that I don't think should have ever been ridden on this bike. And it was always so sketchy because they were carbon drop bars. And I was just like always like had in the back of my mind that these things were going to snap. And eventually they did. So that brings us to Sea Otter 2016. And this is the wildest Sea Otter to date. A lot of things happened that year that shouldn't be mentioned or talked about, but Little Bighorn made a big appearance during the one of the biggest nighttime jump events, where if you've been to the Sea Otter, you probably know what I'm talking about. On the campsite closest to the downhill track, a jump gets built. This year, a couple of shitty cars were parked up against each other, and a big dirt lip was built into essentially a big set of huge whoops that everyone built just so people could watch other riders crash and get mangled. So I signed myself up to try and clear this thing on Little Bighorn. My first attempt, tagged the hood of the second car, went OTB, got out of that crash okay. And for the next run, I know I had to pick up some speed, waited a little bit for the crowds to gather, and I cleared it. And on landing, the bars just instantly snapped. And I went over the bars and luckily avoided getting any carbon shards in my arms or anything. But man, it would have been sweet if those bars held together and I was able to stomp that thing. But, we'll never know if I was going to ride out of it. But yeah, the bars just shattered on impact. And then I think it was that year or maybe the year prior, I took this thing to North Star and was doing live wire laps on it. And I was clearing like over half the jumps on live wire. Had some pretty big crashes on it, but what's nice with this bike is when you crash, you're already like so close to the ground, it more or less like doesn't really matter. And it was slack enough where I never felt like I was really going to go over the bars. I just always like washed out or something. So yeah, took this thing up to North Star for 4th of July weekend. Really flexed this thing on Livewire. And yeah, I rode it from time to time here and there for years whenever it would be just like funny. And I kept it in my garage as just had so many memories that with this bike that like probably should have never happened. And unfortunately, in 2022, I was moving into my trailer to go race full time, and I literally sold everything, got rid of everything in my house. And unfortunately, I wasn't able to find a home for Little Bighorn. It was like one of those things where it was like the last day and everything had to go. And it kind of breaks my heart, but this thing ended up in a dumpster. So I really wish I held on to it, because man, I could make a funny YouTube video. There's definitely a lot of clickbait potential in here. But hopefully, this at least gives you a sense of, what this bike was. And I don't think I'll ever do anything as gnarly as I used to do on this bike anyway. So that's the story. It's Little Bighorn, take life by the horns and do some sketchy shit. So that's kind of what I got up to on this bike. Hope you guys enjoyed that. I'll talk about some, actual mountain bikes here soon with another episode of Old School Bike Reviews. But besides that, thanks for watching, and I'll catch you guys in the next video. Peace.